So today we're going to be looking at the 1980s, and we're going to be looking at the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and it'll be following off a lot of what we discussed last week. So one of the things I tried to emphasize last week with is that there was a change in the American situation in the 1970s, right? Not only was there massive fatigue with the Cold War, the sort of constant fear of what had been going on, there had also become there also was a major recession that the United States and the world was experiencing in the 1970s. So, for a lot of people who had sort of lived through the World War II era and the post World War II era, where the United States had this massive amount of power, this global persona, by the 1980s, or at least by the 1970s, there had been a reduction in that. And the United States was at a point where it was really struggling to keep a global supremacy. So, 1976, Jimmy Carter won the election. He's president from January 1977 through to January 1981. And in the 1980 election, there is this rise of a new conservative majority. So, by the 1980s, there had become, or by 1980, there had become a really massive surge in conservative economics. This deindustrialized world, the world in which people were living in the late 1970s and 80s, was one in which the United States was losing a lot of its power. The United States was a lot of manufacturing was going to other parts of the world. So the United States was certainly in a position where it was significantly reducing its strength. You also have, because of by the 1980s, it's easy to fly around the globe and move goods around the globe. The United States had many corporations moving their headquarters to other parts of the world. So you have increased production in China and Southeast Asia. There's also another major social phenomenon that's going on in terms of the religious right. Technology by the 1980s or by the 1970s is exploding, right? Everybody has a television, at least. Everybody has radios. There's massive communication. And because of that, there is a huge growth in the number of people who are using this, particularly evangelicals, to spread messages, right? So what happens is you have increased popularity of um, these new ministers who are using the radio and other methods to communicate with their flocks. And in particular, they're looking at the new social changes that had come in the 1960s and 70s and trying to roll back that those successes, right? So the big one obviously is abortion, confirmed in the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision. But you obviously have the growth of civil rights, and those things start to move people toward greater right-leaning policies. So when this so coming together, these sort of different groups, this deindustrialized conservative majority mixed with the new religious right, leads to a massive landslide for Ronald Reagan in 1980. So if you look at the map over here on the bottom right, the numbers are representations of the electoral college seats that each gets, right? I hope you notice that 3 is the smallest number any state can have. So in 1980, Ronald Reagan wins 46 states, massive landslide, right? So he wins, you know, uh, you know, he only Jimmy Carter, who was the incumbent, only wins what 20, 30, 34 electoral college seats, while Ronald Reagan wins the vast majority. And the reason he wins is one, I mean, pretty much anybody could have beaten Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, by the late 1970s, had been presiding over a period of massive inflation, massive deindustrialization, massive rusting of the industrial sector. You had the Iran scandal, the Iran hostage scandal in 1979, mixed in with the Iranian Revolution, which um, you know ousts the Shah of Iran, who was an American-supported political leader, and then is replaced by the Ayatollah. So all of these things lead to a massive increase in, or I guess a massive decrease, I should say, in Jimmy Carter's um, popularity. So what happens as a result then is you have a massive switch, and again, 46 states out of 50 go towards Ronald Reagan. Um, and again, I think one of the other things is he's seen as strong on communism and strong on the Soviet Union. And again, when you think about this as a period where the United States is getting fatigued with the um, Cold War, it obviously makes sense, I think, that the United States is turning in the direction of somebody like Reagan. So what is his style, right? So Reagan comes into power, and he is very successful because he's very easy to communicate with, right? Jimmy Carter, I think one of the reasons he won in the 1970s is that he was seen as this sort of grandfatherly figure, even though he was still younger than Reagan when Reagan won. However, Jimmy Carter wore sweaters, and he didn't wear suits. He got on TV wearing sweaters, right? I mean, he wore suits, but he wore sweaters, right? He had this sort of gray, slicked over hair. He was really seen as, again, this sort of grandfatherly figure. He talked about turning down your thermostat and getting cozy, right? He wasn't really the person for the position for the time that he was in the leadership, right? I think he won again because of that. People needed that in the mid 1970s, but by 1980, things had changed, and Reagan comes in as this guy who really has this sort of common touch. There's a lot of pictures of sort of Reagan wearing a Stetson, right? He's wearing a cowboy hat. There's images, they put out images of he and Nancy, his wife, sitting and reading the newspaper, right? You have this sort of image of, oh, this guy's the guy I know. So he has this great sense, of sort of, this great sense of sort of being that common man. He's also a former actor, and he uses that ability to communicate, ability to put on persona, to really help get himself elected. Additionally, I should say that he was the governor of California in the 1960s, and in that role, he is very hard on some of the policies, of the sort of, he's hard on the hippies that are populating San Francisco. He takes a very strong view in LA, with the sort of different race relations there. So for the white people of America, he was certainly seen as this sort of reaction to the sort of changes of the 1960s and 70s that people had not liked. So they call these guys the neoconservatives, right? The disillusionment of the Carter years pushed a lot of independents into the conservative camp, into the Republican camp that may not have been there in the past, right? Sort of, you might think of this group as sort of disenfranchised liberals who had seen the sort of problems of the 60s and 70s and moved to the Republicans. One of the big things that Reagan starts to come in with is this idea of trickle down or supply side economics. So what the idea with the supply side or trickle down economics is that you reduce taxes on the upper echelons, the upper class people and the businesses, so that they have more cash, they can reinvest it into other industries or into their own industry, and that increases hiring. And because there's more hiring, the economy continues to grow, right? It's this idea that by reducing the federal budget and by reducing taxation, you can increase wealth in a country because you're freeing up more money to be reinvested. This also comes with a massive amount of deregulation, right? Because if the government has less money, you can't do quite as much, so you have to reduce the size of the government. But you also, in terms of regulation, it's sort of just seen as the government has too much overreach, and that you can't keep that forever. So one of the things that happens is there's a reduction in the Environmental Protection Agency. They limit the amount of policy surrounding um, sort of government oversight of the environment. The Department of Transportation reduces its regulations on gas emissions, which had been put in place because of the oil crises of the 70s. So that's that's some of Reagan's domestic policies and the things that sort of bring him in the late 70s, right? Now let's turn to him in the world, right? So there are a couple of big things for Reagan, right? One of the things that happens, again, he's concerned about communism. So if you look at sort of Central America in the 1970s, there's a lot of rise in sort of socialist or certainly left-leaning policies. The Reagan administration looks at Central America and realizes that the United States needs a lot of help from Central America. There's American industries in Central America growing food, the United Food Company and others. Manufacturing has moved to Central America. So the United States needs Central America to stay friendly with the United States. So the United States intervenes in places like like El Salvador and Nicaragua during this period. The greatest event here is in the Iran-Contra affair. So in El Salvador, there's the rise of a guy named there's a rise of a left-leaning political figure who the United States doesn't support, and Reagan and the executive branch realizes that it cannot just send money, and Congress refuses to send money to support the people who are not going to support the left-leaning policies. So what the executive branch does is it actually winds up selling money to Israel and moving weapons from Israel to Iran. The money then goes from Iran to Israel to the United States to the executive branch. The money then is sent through that channel to support people who are against this leftist leader in El Salvador. What winds up happening, and when this all comes out, is that there's a massive amount of concern over sort of this, right? This shows Reagan's, even though Reagan didn't know about it, sort of how hands-off he was and how he was giving too much power to the people around him. Other things that happen, right? They try to undo the legacy of the 1960s. So you have more right-leaning judges, more conservative judges being put on the Supreme Court. And again, it's a way to try and limit the power of the liberals and heighten the power of the conservatives. Finally, the Reaganomics economy that is put into place in the 1980s, it just exacerbates the gap between the rich and the poor. The reason is as you are giving more money to reducing the tax on the rich, what happens is obviously they get to keep more money and the cash in their pockets continues to grow and they can reinvest it, but that doesn't necessarily translate to real wage growth for the lower and the middle classes. So what happens here is something that really hurts the middle and lower classes, but it also increases the deficit. So when you increase the deficit, so deficit is money coming in versus what you budget, obviously, and when that when we have a lower deficit, a higher deficit that obviously leads to higher economic trouble.